Elderly folks like you, being of a different class, shouldn't come to the housewarming party. Henrietta, the DIL, loudly declared with a condescending look. We were so astounded by her audacity that we were at a loss for words. I finally reached my limit with Henrietta, who dared to say such things in the absence of our eldest son, Warren. I had kept silent for Warren's sake until now, but I could no longer overlook such behavior. My husband, Reagan, seemed to share my sentiment at her utterly disrespectful attitude. We exchanged glances, nodded in agreement, and said to Henrietta, "Understood." Satisfied, she smiled and went back to Warren. I am Bridget, 73 years old. Warren is our son with Reagan. Warren was always quiet and not one to assert himself, but he began to come into his own in college after graduating high school. He graduated, got a job. And then one day, he returned home after a long time to introduce someone he was seriously dating. The woman he brought was quiet. She didn't talk much, possibly due to nerves, but her sincerity when it came to marrying Warren won us over, and we happily consented to their marriage. I was so happy at their wedding that I cried. Around 3 years into their marriage, during Christmas, Warren and his wife were coming home for the first time, and I was quite excited. We had let them spend their first married Christmas alone, so this return was particularly anticipated. I was looking forward to spending time with Henrietta. When Warren and his wife arrived, I greeted them warmly. Henrietta, initially shy, gradually relaxed, lounging in the recliner by the fireplace in the living room. She seemed to get along well with Reagan, and I was secretly relieved. As it got dark, I stood up to prepare dinner, and Henrietta offered to help in the kitchen. As I was thinking of what she could help with, an unfamiliar voice said, "It's cold, this house is too cold." I was the only one in the kitchen with Henrietta, but the voice, while similar to one I knew, was lower and harsher than usual, and I couldn't understand it. Turning towards Henrietta in disbelief, I saw her rubbing her hands together with a look of discontent I had never seen before. When our eyes met, she didn't even try to hide her displeasure and said in that same unhappy tone, "I hate old houses like this. I really didn't want to come, but Warren insisted. It's just too cold to bear." I was stunned and speechless at her words, so different from the cheerful chatting just moments ago. She was now venting her bad mood at me without any restraint. As I stood there bewildered, Henrietta snorted and looked down on me, saying, "You look like you've seen a ghost, but it was all just an act to get married, you know? Now that we're married, I'm tired of it. Anyway, hurry up and get ready. I'm hungry." Henrietta, seemingly annoyed by my stunned silence, gestured towards the stove and spoke dismissively. Flustered, I hurried to obey, probably more shaken than I realized. Once I started moving, Henrietta did nothing but dictate, not lifting a finger to help. She kept complaining about everything, criticizing my methods, yet she did nothing herself. By the time the preparations were done and it was just a matter of serving the food, Henrietta suddenly became active, charming Reagan and Warren, and blushing at their praise. It was then I finally understood, this was Henrietta's true nature. 10 years later, Warren and his wife were returning for a visit. Henrietta had shown her true colors many times since, but only in my presence. She never behaved that way in front of Reagan or Warren. I had kept silent, thinking it might be a misunderstanding, but the same things happened every time they visited, confirming my suspicions. Hearing they were coming back, I felt a bit downhearted. While planning to avoid being alone with Henrietta as much as possible, the doorbell rang. Sighing, I opened the door to find Warren standing alone. Surprised not to see Henrietta, I involuntarily looked around for her. Warren, noticing my reaction, spoke with a hint of apology. "Sorry, Mom." Henrietta had some urgent work and will join us later. She said it's okay to go ahead with the grave visit without her. It seemed Henrietta wouldn't be joining until her work was finished, and I felt a sense of relief. The thought of not having to witness Henrietta's behavior, even for a little while, lifted my spirits. I welcomed Warren in, and Reagan, who was in the living room, noticed Henrietta's absence and asked about her. While preparing tea, I found myself sighing deeply without realizing it. We decided to relax for the day and postponed the grave visit to the next day. When Warren informed Henrietta, she responded, "Understood. But I still can't finish my work and come over, so please apologize to Bridget and the others for me." Understood. But I still can't finish my work and come over, so please apologize to Bridget and the others for me. Reagan laughed it off as unavoidable, but I couldn't help feeling that Henrietta just didn't want to attend the grave visit. However, I couldn't voice such thoughts, so I just said not to worry about it, and we spent the day uneventfully. The next day, after we finished visiting the grave and were relaxing at home, Henrietta called. "Finally finished with work, so I'll be heading over tonight." The timing of her call, right after the grave visit, seemed a bit off to Reagan and Warren too, but it only heightened my suspicion. That evening, just as we were about to have dinner, Henrietta arrived. She appeared a bit sweaty and out of breath, as if she had rushed, and I frowned involuntarily, but Reagan and Warren were so pleased to see her that I decided not to say anything. Henrietta, having been freed from work, was told to take a shower first while dinner was being prepared. She complied, looking somewhat apologetic. When she emerged from the bathroom at dinner time, she muttered upon seeing the food on the tray. "Sandwiches? That's it after a hot day at the grave? I'm tired of eating this." Ugh, no. I managed to avoid going to someone else's grave in this heat, and all I get is this simple meal? As Henrietta tied up her hair and walked towards the living room, I felt angry, but couldn't find the words to confront her. In the living room, she instantly started chatting happily with Reagan, leaving me silently frustrated. Another 10 years passed, and Warren decided to move from his apartment to a house. After discussing it with Henrietta, they decided to pay as much down payment as possible themselves, but asked us for a little help with the shortfall. Of course, we couldn't refuse our dear Warren's request, so we immediately agreed and transferred the needed amount. Soon after, Warren informed us that their new house was built, and they planned a housewarming party with both families. I hadn't seen Henrietta's parents since the wedding, so I wanted to meet them again, considering everything that had happened. I eagerly agreed to attend. Warren was delighted with my response and immediately shared the news with Henrietta, who I imagined was on the other end of the phone. Thus, we were set to attend the housewarming party next month. A few days after this was decided, Henrietta unexpectedly visited alone. I was surprised by her unannounced visit and opened the door without realizing it was her. "Yes, who is it?" Looking up, I saw Henrietta with an unhappy expression, and I was taken aback. "I'll come in." Henrietta quickly checked for keys in the entrance and pushed past me to enter the house. Her arrogant behavior continued as she walked into the living room, probably because she noticed that Reagan's keys weren't in the entrance. Indeed, Reagan was out for his daily walk and wouldn't be back for a while. Taking advantage of this, Henrietta had barged into our home. Feeling trapped, I followed her into the living room, where she waited for me without sitting down. As I entered, before I could even close the door, Henrietta glared at me and said, "Bridget, you're planning to come to the housewarming party? It's a nuisance, so can you please not come?" "What are you suddenly talking about?" I responded, taken aback. Reagan wasn't there, so Henrietta, crossing her arms, started speaking in a high-handed manner. "You're planning to tattle to my parents about me, aren't you? Henrietta glared at me with evident disgust, clearly not wanting her parents to know about her behavior. She must have specifically chosen a time when Warren was working and she had a day off. No doubt, she knew about Reagan's routine walk and had timed her visit accordingly. Henrietta was cunning indeed. I had no such intention, but now that you mention it, it might not be a bad idea, I said calmly, to which Henrietta frowned in annoyance. It's no joke. I married Warren because he's good-looking and earns decently. I don't want to deal with annoying relatives. Revealing the true reason for marrying Warren, Henrietta's expression froze when she saw my astonished face. As I was wondering about Henrietta's strange behavior, the living room door opened behind me. Turning around, I saw Reagan, who looked surprised as he gazed at Henrietta. Realizing that her conversation with me had been overheard, Henrietta clicked her tongue but seemed to decide to brazen it out, telling us, "Anyway, elderly folks like you, being of a different class, shouldn't come to the housewarming party." We were so astounded by her audacity that we were at a loss for words. I finally reached my limit with Henrietta, who dared to say such things even in Warren's absence. I had kept silent for Warren's sake until now, but I could no longer overlook such behavior. My husband, Reagan, seemed to share my sentiment at her utterly disrespectful attitude. We exchanged glances, nodded in agreement, and said to Henrietta, "Understood." Satisfied, she smiled and went back to Warren. Left behind, we felt suddenly very tired and sat down on the sofa. On the day of the housewarming party, we didn't go to Warren and his wife's home. We hadn't told Warren anything about the incident with Henrietta. Naturally, he must have thought we were coming. By now, Warren and his wife might be panicking. Sipping coffee with Reagan at a cafe, I pondered this. Then, Reagan's mobile phone rang. He got up, answered the call, and stepped out of the cafe. I quickly paid the bill and followed him out. Getting into the car, Reagan switched the phone to speaker mode so I could hear Warren's voice too. "Dad, something strange is happening. All my relatives have suddenly got other plans, and you and Mom haven't arrived yet. Even Henrietta's relatives are canceling one after another. What's going on?" Feeling guilty about Warren's anxious tone but deciding to play dumb, we exchanged glances. Who knows? "What's Henrietta saying?" Reagan asked, sounding casual. His acting was so natural that it surprised me. Noticing my reaction, Reagan winked and gestured to keep it a secret. I had to stifle a laugh, covering my mouth. Henrietta is also confused. "Oh, another call's coming in. I'll call back later. Be safe coming over." Warren still seemed to expect our visit, making me feel remorseful, but I convinced myself it was necessary to get back at Henrietta. Then my mobile phone rang. It was a relative who was supposed to attend today's party. Feeling sorry but chatting for a bit, I was engaged in a long conversation with the talkative relative when Reagan's phone rang again. It was Warren. Reagan switched to speaker mode and answered. "Dad, I just spoke to Henrietta's mom. What's going on? If you can still come, please do, right away." Warren's voice, sounding close to tears, made me feel a tightness in my chest. Reagan looked at me with furrowed brows. After I nodded at Reagan, he reassured Warren. "Understood, we'll be right there. Calm down." With that, Warren, sounding relieved, hung up. Then, we, who were at a cafe near Warren's new home, drove towards his place. Upon arriving and ringing the doorbell, Warren came rushing out to greet us. Behind him was Henrietta, glaring at us with furious eyes. Once inside, Warren ushered us to the living room sofa. Waiting for us to sit on the sofa, Warren eagerly asked, "I didn't expect you to arrive so soon. Where were you? What's going on? All our relatives are angry. Henrietta's relatives are apologizing, and I have no idea what's happening. Calm down, Warren. First of all, congratulations on your new home. I'll explain everything now. Saying that to calm Warren down, I turned to Henrietta, who was silently sitting. You know why we're the only ones here, don't you, Henrietta? What do you mean? Henrietta feigned ignorance, prompting me to sigh lightly before starting. It seems you didn't want us here, but given the current situation, your worries are gone, aren't they? You didn't want us here? What does that mean? Warren sounded confused. I smiled slightly and continued. Both your relatives and ours know everything now. Unfortunately, your plans have failed. You've already been reprimanded by your relatives, haven't you? You shouldn't have. A low growl, unmistakably from Henrietta, was heard. Reagan and Warren, hearing this for the first time, were astonished. Ignoring this, I continued, looking straight at Henrietta. Given Warren's reaction, you've been pretending to be good ever since you were dating him. Now that your true nature is exposed, why don't you just accept it? I didn't invite you. What? Her voice, now much quieter than before, made Warren lean in closer to hear her repeat. Henrietta suddenly raised her head and stood up, starting to yell. I didn't invite you. I told you not to come. Why did you come anyway? And spreading lies among the relatives, framing me, is that fun for you? Taken aback by her intensity, Warren recoiled. I sighed at Henrietta, still insisting she was the victim. Mobile phones are so handy, aren't they, Henrietta? I nodded at Reagan. He took out his phone, operated it, and then looked at Warren. I just wanted to marry Warren because he's good-looking and earns decently. I don't want to deal with troublesome relatives. Anyway, elderly folks like you, being of a different class, shouldn't come to the housewarming party. Henrietta's words from that day played from Reagan's mobile phone. Henrietta turned pale and looked at Warren. After the playback, Warren turned slowly to Henrietta, his mouth agape. Henrietta tried to deny it, but what excuse could she give after that recording? The weather turned bad, so I cut my walk short and came back, only to hear this incredible conversation. I couldn't help but record it. Glad it was useful. Hearing Reagan's regretful words, Warren looked at me for confirmation. I nodded firmly. I couldn't believe it at first either, Warren. But the truth is there in the recording. Henrietta's true feelings, and her last words were said despite my presence. It's hard to escape now, Reagan said, fixing his gaze on Henrietta. Could anyone stay calm knowing she had been deceiving everyone since her dating days with Warren, let alone after their marriage? Seeing his look, Henrietta dropped her shoulders and ceased her struggle. This seemed like an affirmation to Warren, who abruptly stood up and left the house. It happened so suddenly that we couldn't stop him, and although Reagan hurried after him, he soon returned. Apparently, Warren had driven off somewhere, leaving his mobile phone behind, making it impossible for us to call him. Henrietta, left behind and surrounded by us, sat trembling and pale, huddled up. As time passed helplessly, Warren eventually returned, holding something in his hand, which he slammed in front of Henrietta, saying quietly, "Sign the divorce papers and leave." What? Henrietta looked up at Warren, her mouth agape. But Warren repeated himself, took a pen from the holder on the table, and began to fill in his part. After finishing, he forced the pen into Henrietta's hand and tapped on the divorce papers. Come on, write and leave. Overwhelmed, Henrietta, though frightened, filled in her part. She looked at Warren when finished, but he, without making eye contact, was checking for any missing details. Finding no errors, he forcefully made Henrietta stand up and dragged her to the front door. He then pushed Henrietta out of the house, ignoring her attempts to cling to him and throwing her bag outside. "It's late, so I'll submit this tomorrow. Don't ever come back to this property," he said, slamming the door shut and locking it. Henrietta's pleading voice could be heard from outside. But Warren ignored it and turned to apologize to us. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I had no idea she was like that." We could say nothing to his deep apology, just embracing him. Before long, Henrietta's voice faded away. We decided to stay at Warren's new home that night. The next morning, Warren submitted the divorce papers first thing and his divorce from Henrietta was finalized. Concerned about his heartache, we chose to stay another night, and that evening, with a somewhat calmer Warren, we discussed everything that had happened. As we recounted the past events, Warren listened with clenched fists. Reagan, who was also unaware of these details, placed his hand on my shoulder as I spoke. Then, we revealed the truth about the current situation. After Henrietta had left telling us not to come, I learned that Reagan had spontaneously recorded the conversation. We decided together to inform Henrietta's parents. When we called and explained the situation, Henrietta's parents, initially in disbelief, changed their attitude and kept apologizing after hearing the recorded audio. Angry about their daughter's misdeeds, they intended to tell the relatives who had planned to attend the housewarming party not to go. After hanging up, we discussed and decided to do the same with our relatives. They too were furious and said they wouldn't attend. This is how the current situation unfolded. Hearing all this, Warren's shoulders drooped again. Worried, but unable to do anything, we decided to spend another night. The next day, Warren came into the living room looking relieved and shared what happened the previous night. He had apparently contacted his former in-laws. Henrietta was now at her parents' home, being disowned and facing eviction. They also planned to bring alimony, which would be imposed on Henrietta as her debt. While Warren felt this was not enough, he seemed more settled than expected. After returning home, we immediately started packing up. Our old house, now dated, was set to be handed over. The house was actually being remodeled for us to live in together. Since Warren was at work during the day, the renovations were to take place then. Though costly to modify a newly built home, with some financial gain from the recent events and our help, the decision was made. While waiting for the house's remodeling, we were happily clearing out our old home. "I'm taking the house, the savings, and the retirement fund. You can go live in a home." "Understood." These were the last words spoken to me by my husband of 35 years on the final day of our marriage. Rather than cherishing the effort I put into raising our children, caring for our parents, and working tirelessly, he chose to cast me aside in the most humiliating way. What was the meaning of my 35 years of dedication? He left all responsibilities to me while he enjoyed nights out. Never once did he express gratitude, as if my efforts were expected. Looking back, I'm amazed at how long I endured this treatment. But now, it's time for me to live my life in my golden years. I thought it was my husband's turn to be miserable. My name is Grace, I'm 60 years old. Working part-time at a food company's factory. My husband's name is Robert, he's 65. We met through a mutual acquaintance and got married when I was 25, marking 35 years of marriage. Our relationship began with what was then popular group dating, and after several dates, influenced by our friends, we started dating. As we met more and more, we both started to think that if we were to marry anyone, it would be each other. Getting married felt like a natural progression. Starting our life together, I realized Robert had no savings. In the beginning, we lived in a small apartment. with most living expenses covered by me. Robert's low income made me anxious about our future, so I continued working, sometimes unable to manage household chores due to overtime. You're late. I'm hungry already. Did you wait? You could have eaten first. How can I eat when there's nothing to eat? Robert often came home earlier than me, as he rarely worked overtime, yet he never helped with household chores. Isn't it a woman's job to do the housework? We're not in that era anymore. That time was when women were starting to make significant strides in the workforce. The term career woman was becoming common, but Robert insisted that household duties were a woman's job, as if stuck in an outdated mindset. I would have preferred being a housewife if it were financially feasible. Balancing work and home life is what defines the modern woman. Our situation wasn't exactly the stereotype of a henpecked husband, but reflected Robert's tendency to interpret things in a way that suited him. While I was constrained, Robert often went out drinking. If you're going to be late, at least let me know. Quit nagging! It's my time! I can do what I want! His tone grew even harsher when he came home drunk. While I couldn't freely use my own money or time, Robert enjoyed his. I feel like I'm always getting the short end of the stick. Early in our marriage, I was so frustrated that I considered divorce. But when I confided in my mom, she strongly advised against it. I also worried about societal judgment and lacked the courage to leave. Living together meant acknowledging both the good and the bad, I constantly reminded myself. After my husband Robert received his paycheck, he'd either go out for drinks or just enjoy his freedom. He never considered taking on a side job or working overtime. Instead, he'd leave work on time, choosing between heading out for drinks or coming home. When he did come home and found me not there, he'd complain. I hate coming home to an empty house. Seeing the lights off through the window stresses me out. But sometimes I have to work late. I'd respond, "What's the point of you working overtime? You should find a different job." He'd retort. Robert took it upon himself to call my workplace and suggested they let me go. Whether my boss wanted to avoid getting involved in whatever was happening or had already wanted to fire me, I was encouraged to resign. It became uncomfortable to stay, so I left a job that was hard to get in the first place. Now, I was faced with the daunting task of job hunting again. Having already left 2 companies, my resume wasn't passing the initial screenings. In a panic, why not work part-time? I'm working full-time anyway, Robert casually mentioned. I wasn't particularly career-driven, so I didn't cling to my aspirations. However, I was worried if we could manage on Robert's salary alone. So, I took on 2 part-time jobs. One as an early morning cleaner and another as a supermarket cashier. I'd even work overtime at the supermarket on days I knew Robert would be home late. I made sure to be home when Robert was around and worked diligently when he wasn't. I endured years of this routine, convincing myself that Robert needed me. I found his desire to have me home when he returned somewhat endearing at the time. A year into our marriage, I gave birth to our first son. Our apartment is getting too cramped. Yeah, the kid will want his own room when he's older, and he might even want siblings. Around that time, Robert's mom, Karen, who was a divorced single mother, suggested we live together. Probably, she felt lonely after Robert, her only child, left home. It's all positives, right? We won't have to pay rent, Robert said, likely echoing Karen's words. I wanted some time to think it over. Mom's already getting things ready, he pressed, revealing that a room for our son was already being prepared, complete with new wallpaper. I was shocked at how far they had progressed with their plans without me. Wanting to continue working part-time, I agreed, albeit a bit lightly. A decision I would soon regret. Karen seemed to have it out for me, delivering daily doses of sarcasm. It's sad for the child to see his mom work so much. I can't believe this. It wasn't like this in my time, she'd say. Karen had never worked. After her divorce, she relied on her parents to raise Robert. Karen's family was somewhat wealthy, so there was money. Now, it seems she's living off a small inheritance and a meager pension. Though her spending habits seemed a bit extravagant. Her kindness extended to her hobbies and her son and grandson, but never to me. Meals were prepared without considering me, and I was often left behind on outings. I was thankful she looked after my grandson, though. With Karen taking over the household, Robert told me, "You can work full-time now, overtime included." What? Why all of a sudden? I asked, baffled. "Since Mom's here, you can go work," he said. I thought to myself, what a selfish person he is. It was then I realized that when he said he wanted me to stay home, it wasn't because he wanted me there, but rather someone to take care of his needs. I started my mornings by dropping off our child at the childcare center, then heading to work as a temp. Fortunately, Karen was always willing to pick up our grandson, which allowed me to rely on her for the return trips. Being able to work overtime without complaints was a relief. This routine continued for about 10 years until Karen began to act strangely. "Who are you?" "A thief, I guess." "Robert, call the police." "No, it's me, Grace." Karen had developed Alzheimer's disease and saw me as a complete enemy. She increasingly failed to recognize Robert and our son as well. One day, while wandering, she was involved in a traffic accident and became bedridden. "This is your fault. You're responsible for taking care of her," Robert blamed me. "How is it my fault? You shouldn't be working late nights." "But you're the one who said I could work." Our arguments became endless. I considered leaving with our son, but couldn't abandon Karen. Besides, our son loved both Robert and Karen too much for me to separate them. Karen, who never accepted me as family, complained daily while I cared for her. When I confided in Robert, he dismissed it simply. "She has dementia, what can you do?" Eventually, I quit my job and became increasingly isolated. I had hoped Karen might become kinder to me, thinking I was a stranger due to her condition, but that was wishful thinking. She must have inherently disliked me. Yet, she was still an important grandmother to our son. I cared for Karen alone until she passed away. After Karen's death and our son becoming independent, only Robert and I remained. With Robert's retirement coming up next year, I looked forward to traveling together and exploring new places. However, Robert presented me with something shocking. "Mine's already filled out. Just sign and submit it." "A divorce application?" "It's obvious if you look at it. You're really dumb, you know." That's what's been so annoying. I felt as if I'd been punched. It felt like I might collapse right there. "Why? Did I do something to deserve a divorce? If I had to say, I don't want to spend the rest of my life with you." "What do you mean?" Robert looked at me with a scornful smile and dropped a bombshell. "I want to marry someone else." And then, there was Robert's mistress. It seems their affair had been going on for years. The mistress was 20 years younger than me. "Even when I was taking care of Mom and raising our child, you were cheating?" "That's about right." The anger inside me was about to explode. While I endured Karen's harsh words, took care of our child, and suffered loneliness all by myself, Robert was out having fun with his mistress. I wish I never knew this. "You've been deceiving me all along. I'll never forgive you." "And what are you going to do about it?" "Like you could do anything." Robert taunted me with a smirk. "So, you're divorcing me to be with her?" "That's right. She's much younger than you." "Understood. I'll sign the divorce papers. But just so you know, I'll be seeking compensation from both of you." "Fine by me. I'll pay whatever amount." I've got mom's inheritance, after all. Oh, but just so you know, I'm not splitting any property with you. I took a moment to think. I had some savings of my own, which I didn't want Robert or his mistress to get their hands on. Okay, I'll settle for the compensation. In return, we don't split my assets either. Robert burst out laughing at that. Your money isn't worth much anyway. I don't need it. We signed the documents in the presence of lawyers, agreeing not to pursue a division of property but to settle on a compensation claim. I received $30,000, which seemed to be paid out in a lump sum from Karen's estate. He probably wanted to start his new life with his mistress as quickly as possible, resolving any messy ties with money. After the lawyer left, I'm taking the house, the savings, and the retirement funds. You can go live in a home, Robert said. And so, I did end up moving into a facility. Not because Robert told me to, but because it seemed like a more enjoyable way to spend my retirement. The house was originally Robert's family home, and I had nowhere else to live. My sister and her husband were living in my family home, and I didn't want to impose on my son and his wife. I knew Robert had no savings, so dividing property would have been pointless. I preferred to get the divorce over with quickly and was confident I could make it on my own from now on. Robert was the heir to Karen's estate, and the compensation was enough for me. Months later, Robert showed up at the facility, though I hadn't given him my current address. He wasn't supposed to know I had moved into the facility. He must have used some agency to find me. I wondered what he could possibly want after all this time. There were other residents at the facility, so I asked him to wait on the outdoor terrace. Seeing Robert sitting there, looking around, I felt a sense of pity. What had I ever seen in this man to marry him? It was a mystery even to myself. Sorry to keep you waiting. What do you want? What's all this about? Robert confronted me without a greeting, clearly shocked. I played dumb, knowing full well why he was surprised. Why are you here all of a sudden? How did you find me? It took me forever to track you down since you wouldn't contact me. You didn't tell our son either, did you? He had no idea. I didn't want to bother him, as he has his own family now. But that doesn't answer my question. How did you find out about this place? I hired a detective. When I mentioned I needed to contact you about the compensation, they found you. Having an ex-husband is quite handy. So, he had gone through an agency after all. Which detective agency was it? I was furious at the breach of privacy but kept my cool. More importantly, how can someone like you afford to stay in such a luxurious facility? That was what Robert was astonished about. After our divorce, I had moved into a high-end facility that we had once considered for our retirement. It wasn't your typical nursing home, but more of a luxury apartment complex with an attached hospital. There was also a dining hall run by a nutritionist, and I spent my days enjoying the company of other residents and helpers. You could be on your own if you wished, and someone would check on each room daily to ensure no one had fallen. Each room was equipped with an emergency call button for immediate assistance. I heard this place costs $1 million? How do you have that kind of money? Actually, I've been investing for the past 35 years, ever since we got married. I wanted to ensure we could enjoy our retirement together. I had been laid off during a recession and struggled to find a new job, which drained my savings and filled me with anxiety. Understanding the unpredictability of life, I realized that saving money wasn't enough and started learning about investments. I didn't want to seem greedy, so I never told Robert, whom I was dating at the time. I began investing modestly. After we got married, my desire for us to enjoy good food and travel in our retirement grew stronger, prompting me to invest more seriously. Since we both worked, I gradually invested my earnings, sacrificing outings with friends, delicious meals, shopping, and vacations, putting all my disposable income into investments. After 35 years of consistent investing, I amassed a significant fortune. Partly because I started right when the economy was down. When I shared this, Robert claimed, "Then that money is mine too." I had anticipated he would say something like that. "Sorry, but you have no claim to my money." "Why not? I'm your ex-husband. It should be part of my assets too." "You renounced any claim to my assets in front of our lawyers. Have you forgotten already?" "Damn, that's why you insisted on a lawyer. You tricked me." "Who's been deceiving whom all along?" Robert's face twisted in frustration. Realizing this conversation was a waste of time, I urged him to leave. "No way. I'm not leaving. I'll live here too." I was speechless with disbelief. Shortly after, a security guard arrived, prompted by another resident who noticed my distress and escorted Robert out. Due to his harassing behavior, Robert was banned from the facility and added to the blacklist. Curious about his persistence, I contacted our son, who revealed that Robert was in debt. After our divorce, Robert planned to marry his mistress. However, she became furious upon learning about the compensation he paid me. To appease her, Robert lavished her with gifts. But she eventually left him for a younger man without marrying him. "Are you dumping me after all I've spent on you?" It was too late for regrets. The mistress had moved on, losing interest in a now penniless Robert. It turns out she was using Robert as a convenient source of money, likely having always preferred the younger man. I couldn't believe a woman 20 years younger would seriously consider marrying someone like Robert. It seems he was the only one who truly believed in his affair turning into marriage, which must have been a huge shock to him. After donating all of his inheritance to his mistress and accumulating debt, Robert ended up alone in a house that was over 70 years old. The house was in bad shape, with many parts broken and no money for repairs. He now lives alone in a leaky home. My son expressed no interest in helping him. Recently, a community worker visited, asking Robert to at least repair the exterior walls because it was affecting the neighboring house. Robert's angry outburst over this request led to a police incident. My son had to pick up his father from the police station, where he told Robert they were through. "You're abandoning me too?" Robert cried, clinging to his son, who shook him off. Discarded by his son, I thought how pitiful Robert was. After the incident with the police, he became a pariah in the neighborhood, spending his weekends indoors. After telling me about Robert's current situation, my son asked me to keep in touch occasionally. I was touched that he cared. Sometime after talking to my son, I received a call from Robert. Ignoring it, he then called the facility directly. Such persistence. The staff were worried for me. I decided to answer just once. "I just need a little money." "I refuse." "Don't you have a pension?" Robert was supposed to have recently retired, so his claim of having no money seemed like a lie. "I didn't get anything." "Don't lie. You received a pension, didn't you?" "I got fired just before retirement because of the affair." Turns out, Robert was fired just short of retirement. Apparently, his mistress was a co-worker. After breaking up, Robert's stalking scared her into reporting him to their employer. Ultimately, his affair was exposed, leading to his dismissal without a pension. His stalking and the resulting police involvement also became a problem. I felt no sympathy for his story. I asked the facility staff to call the police if he contacted again. When Robert realized he couldn't reach me by phone, he resorted to sending letters. The letter began with, "I want to see you again. I'm lonely." But towards the end, "I need some money." The content changed to things like that. I think he's struggling. There was a time I inadvertently laughed. I forgot which letter it was, but the ink was slightly smeared. It looked like it was from tears, but I suspect it was just water. I wondered what the point of such a performance was. Truly, it must be hard for him. The letters stopped after about a year when I didn't respond. Years passed, and I had completely forgotten about Robert. Then one day, while I was shopping, a man in dirty clothes, emitting a slight odor, approached me. It was undoubtedly Robert, now thin with almost entirely white hair and a bushy beard. "Isn't that Grace?" I was shocked by how much he had changed. "I've finally found you. Let's start over. You're all I have." Feeling frightened as Robert grabbed my hand, he insisted. "It's me, Robert. You recognize me, right?" "I do, but we are strangers now. Goodbye." As I tried to leave, Robert blocked my path, looking at me with desperate eyes, then suddenly begged, "Please, come back home. I don't want to be alone in my old age. You are the one who drove me away. Have you forgotten?" "I'm apologizing, aren't I?" "Sorry isn't enough. I've moved on. You should too." Despite my attempts to ignore him, Robert kept chasing me, repeatedly bowing his head. "We're divorced, Robert. Stop this." "I was wrong. You're the most important thing to me. I've realized that now." "It's too late." As I tried to distance myself, Robert grabbed my arm. Then, "Could you let go of her, please?" "Who are you?" "This is my husband." "What?" I had remarried. My new husband's name is Matthew. 2 years my senior. We got close in the same facility where we met. It was Matthew who had called security when Robert visited. This was shared with me by another resident, and I was drawn to their considerate and kind nature. We naturally spent more time together and decided to marry. Despite wondering if it was odd to remarry at our age, we chose happiness for our final chapter. Matthew pulled Robert away from me. "You remarried?" "Yes. So please leave me alone." "So that's how it is." Robert was visibly shaken. I was worried he might lash out at Matthew in anger, but he had no energy left. Instead, he collapsed, crying on the spot. "Please stop. It's embarrassing." "Shut up. Don't bother me," Robert cried unabashedly, as onlookers watched from afar. I thought it was a pitiful sight. A grown man, crouched down on the street, crying. Is this something a person can do without shame? Or perhaps, am I being tested? "Grace, let's go." "Yes." Encouraged by Matthew, I left the scene behind. Since then, Robert has not appeared before me again. According to my son, Robert still lives in the same old, unrepaired house, unable to properly take care of household chores and accumulating garbage to the point of generating complaints for the smell. My son has been inconvenienced by repeated contacts every time there's a complaint. Despite attempts to reason with him, my son finally lost his patience. In front of a city official, "He's not my son," Robert declared. Following that, attempts to contact my son ceased when Robert reacted angrily to them. It seems the authorities have also given up, deeming any effort futile. Truly, Robert has become a neighborhood nuisance. However, that's no longer my concern. Ultimately, abandoned by everyone, Robert lives in isolation. "If only I hadn't started that affair," my son mentioned hearing Robert say. But to me, it's not about the affair. It's the price of living selfishly, without regard for others, now coming back to haunt him. It's his responsibility. Humans may be prone to making regrettable decisions, but continuing without reflection for over 70 years is merely pitiful. Robert will likely never realize this, having destroyed his own future. The task of repairing it falls to him, though he may lack the strength to do so. I hope he faces his actions and lives on. I'm thankful to Robert. Had I continued to rely on him, my later years would have been disastrous. His decision to divorce because of his affair allowed me to live my life. I've started to communicate more frequently with my son. It was a turning point when Emily, my son's wife, who mediated between us, said, "Please don't worry about it." That moment made me realize how much of my life was spent overly accommodating others. I had distanced myself from my adult son to avoid burdening him. Shocked when he expressed his dislike for his grandmother and father from childhood. Aware of the mistreatment and infidelity, I've resolved to live the rest of my life without such undue consideration. Now, my son's family and grandchildren visit, allowing us to make up for lost time in conversation. My son seems a bit shy, but it's strange how he can talk naturally when his wife and grandchildren are around. He has accepted Matthew, and to my grandchildren, Matthew is like a real grandfather. Currently, Matthew and I enjoy our time in the facility, surrounded by friends and content. My priority is health, hoping for a long life.